The air inside the Atlanta courthouse hung heavy that morning, thick with the kind of humidity that clung to every breath and seeped into the bones. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual restless energy, car horns blaring, voices weaving into a chaotic symphony, the heartbeat of a place that never paused to catch its breath. But within these walls, a different rhythm ruled, a tense, suffocating stillness that seemed to coil around the marble floors and settle into the creases of the dark wooden benches. This was a space meant to embody justice, a grand stage where right was supposed to triumph over wrong. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, it felt less like a sanctuary of fairness and more like a theater where power played its cruel games, where the scales of justice tilted under the weight of unseen hands. Malik Carter, barely 16, stepped through the towering doors with a quiet resolve that belied his years. Tall for his age, his frame was lean, but carried a strength that came from something deeper than muscular resilience, forged in the fires of a world that had never made room for him. His face was a mask of calm, his dark eyes steady, though not lifeless. They flickered with a guarded awareness he'd learned to wear like armor. Around his neck hung a gold chain, its pendant resting against his chest like a silent vow. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a tether to his father, a man whose memory lived in the cool metal, a man who'd walked the same unforgiving earth and left Malik this one piece of proof that he'd mattered. Every time Malik touched it, he felt the echo of his father's voice, a whisper that told him to stand tall, no matter what. Beside him walked his mother, Judge Camille Carter, a woman whose very presence seemed to shift the air around her. She moved with the grace of someone who'd fought for every inch of ground she claimed, her head held high, her tailored robe a symbol of victories hard-won against a system that had tried to lock her out. Her reputation preceded here a force of nature, a name spoken in hushed tones of respect laced with a hint of unease. She'd climbed those marble steps not just for herself, but for Malik, determined that her son would never have to bend beneath the weight of anyone's judgment. Yet, even she knew the truth that lingered in the shadows of this place. Justice wasn't blind here. Too often, it peeked through narrowed eyes, sizing up those who dared to stand confidently, especially a black boy like Malik, whose quiet pride could be mistaken for defiance. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and stale coffee, the kind that had been left to scorch in a pot somewhere down the hall. Lawyers glided through the corridors, their suits pressed to perfection, their sharp gazes cutting through the crowd. Defendants slumped on benches, their hands fidgeting, shoulders bowed under the burden of fates already half-written. Amid this restless hum stood Officer Gerald Langley, a man who carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never heard the word no. His uniform was pristine, his badge catching the harsh fluorescent light. But it wasn't the polish that defined him, it was the unshakable belief that he could act without consequence. His face was all hard angles, chiseled like stone, and might have been striking if not for the smirk that twisted his lips into something cruel. That smirk said everything. He didn't see people. He saw labels, categories to sort and control, and he relished the chance to remind them of their place. When Langley's eyes landed on Malik, a shadow passed over his features, a glint of something dark and knowing. His gaze dropped to the gold chain, that small, gleaming defiance against Malik's skin, and his smirk widened. He took a step forward, his boots thudding against the floor with a predator's slow deliberation, each movement heavy with intent. The space between them crackled with unspoken tension, a silent challenge hanging in the air. Malik's stomach twisted, a knot of instinct warning him of what was coming. But he kept his eyes locked on Langley's, refusing to flinch. "You shouldn't be wearing something like that," Langley drawled, his voice low and dripping with mockery, as if the sight of Malik young, black, unafraid offend some unspoken rule of the world he policed. His thick fingers twitched at his side, itching to act. Malik felt the words like a slap, his jaw tightening as his hand brushed the pendant, the metal cool against his fingertips. His heart thudded faster, a drumbeat of anger and pride, but he forced his face to stay still. "Unreadable, excuse me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Langley didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he closed the distance between them, his smirk stretching into something uglier. Without warning, his hand shot out, fingers closing around the chain. With a single, vicious tug, he yanked it free, the sharp edges of the pendant slicing across Malik's skin, leaving a thin, stinging red mark just below his collarbone. The courtroom erupted in a collective gasp, a wave of shock rippling through the onlookers, pausing mid-stride, defendants lifting their heads, whispers swelling like a tide. But Langley didn't care. He held the chain aloft, letting it dangle between his fingers like a hunter displaying a kill, a trophy snatched from someone he deemed unworthy. "You don't belong here," he muttered, his voice a low growl meant only for Malik's ears. "People like you never do." The words cut deeper than the pendant ever could, slicing into Malik's core. His heart pounded, a wild rhythm that threatened to break free. His fists trembled at his sides, every muscle in his body screaming to lash out, to reclaim what was his. But he couldn't not hear, not now. His mother's presence anchored him, her calm authority a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge. She sat just a few feet away, her posture unyielding, her silence a shield. Malik clung to that, forcing the fire inside him to smolder instead of blaze. The shame burned, the rage roared. The weight of being reduced to nothing in a room full of silent witnesses pressed down on him. Like a physical force, Langley's arrogance swelled, unchecked and shameless. He chuckled to himself, slipping the chain into his pocket as if it were nothing to trinket, a spoil of war. "What, you think someone's gonna stop me?" he sneered, his eyes sweeping the room with mock innocence. "I was just confiscating stolen property." The lie landed like a punch, and Malik's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. Stolen? That chain wasn't stolen, it was his father's, the only piece of him Malik had left. A sacred thread tying him to a man who'd fought the same battles Langley now waged with a smirk. To hear it dismissed, to see it pocketed like trash, lit a fury in Malik that threatened to consume him. But then the air shifted. A hush fell over the room, thick and oppressive, swallowing the murmurs and the rustling of papers. The sound of heels clicking against the wooden floor pierced the silence, low, deliberate, each step a drumbeat of impending consequence. Langley's smirk faltered, just for a moment, as he turned his head. His eyes narrowed, sensing something amiss, but his pride drowned out his instincts. And then he saw her. Judge Camille Carter rose from her seat, her movements measured, her expression a mask of steel. The realization hit Langley like a freight train, his face twitching as his mind raced to catch up. His gaze darted between the boy he'd humiliated and the woman now standing before him, her eyes burning with a cold, unyielding fire. She didn't need to speak, her presence alone shifted the room, turning it from Langley's playground into something far more dangerous. The courthouse, once a stage for his unchecked power, now tightened around him like a noose. Malik watched his mother, his chest tight with a mix of awe and fury. He could feel the eyes of the room on Theman, her strength, on his pain, and he knew this wasn't over. Langley had crossed a line, not just with Malik, but with the wrong family. The officer's smirk was gone now, replaced by a flicker of unease he couldn't hide. He'd thought himself untouchable, a king in his little kingdom of cruelty. But he'd misjudged the forces he'd provoked. What came next would ripple beyond these walls, a reckoning that would shake the onlookers to their core and echo through the halls of a system that too often turned a blind eye. For Malik, it wasn't just about the chain, it was about the lesson carved into that moment. Power, when abused, sows the seeds of its own downfall. And for Langley, the consequences of his arrogance were about to bloom, cold and unrelenting. A justice served not with fanfare, but with the quiet, devastating weight of accountability. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with tension that seemed to coil around Malik like a living thing. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, each one a quiet battle to keep the storm raging inside him under control. Beneath the surface of his calm exterior, a fire simmered, danger, hurt, and something deeper, something primal that clawed at his ribs, begging to be let loose. His fingers curled tighter round the edges of his father's pendant, the cool metal pressing into his palm like an anchor, the last tether to a man he'd lost too soon. The faint grooves of the design bit into his skin, grounding him, reminding him of who he was, even as the world around him threatened to strip that away. Across from him, Officer Langley stood with a posture that oozed entitlement, his broad shoulders squared, his chin tilted just enough to signal he owned this moment. A faint chuckle escaped his lips, the sound dry and hollow, like the rustle of dead leaves skittering across pavement. He shook his head slowly, as if Malik's very existence amused him, but his eye sharp, cold, and devoid of any real warmth told a different story. "Gold like that," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "doesn't sit right on a kid like you. Tell me, where'd you swipe it from?" The words hit Malik like a slap, sharp and stinging. But they weren't new. He'd heard variations of this tune his whole life, accusations thrown like stones, each one chipping away at something inside him. Still, he didn't flinch. His grip on the pendant tightened, his knuckles whitening as he forced out a response through gritted teeth. "I didn't steal it. This was my father's." Langley's lips twitched into a deeper smirk, a predator's grin that didn't reach his eyes. His fingers flexed at his sides, a subtle shift in his stance that made him seem larger, more imposing, as if he were staking a claim on the very air between them. He didn't believe Malik didn't want to believe him. The truth didn't matter to him. It never had. "Sure it was," he murmured, his tone thick with mockery, each syllable laced with a venom that made Malik's stomach churn. Before Malik could process the weight of that dismissal, before he could draw another breath to defend himself, Langley moved. His hand shot forward, swift and unapologetic, snatching the chain from Malik's neck in one brutal yank. The snap of the metal breaking echoed through the room, a sound so loud it seemed to freeze time, reverberating off the polished wood walls and marble floors like a gunshot. Pain flared where the pendant scraped against Malik's skin, a bright, fleeting sting that faded quickly, but it was nothing compared to the ache that followed. The emptiness hit him like a tidal wave, a hollow void where the chain had rested against his chest for years. A piece of his father now torn away as if it meant nothing. Langley held the chain aloft, letting it dangle between his fingers like a hunter displaying a fresh kill. The gold glinted under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights, twisting as he rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, inspecting it with a casual arrogance that made Malik's blood boil. "See, now this," Langley mused, tilting his head as if appraising a trinket he'd plucked from a pawn shop shelf. "This looks like something that belongs in an evidence locker." His voice carried a smug satisfaction, as if what he'd just done, ripping a boy's heritage from his neck, was not only justified, but commendable. "And you," he added, his gaze flicking back to Malik with a sneer, "you look like you belong in a holding cell." Malik's breath came in short, ragged bursts. His fists clenched so tightly his nails dug crescent moons into his palms. The heat of humiliation surged through him, a molten tide that threatened to drown his restraint. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to lunge, to rip the chain back from Langley's grasp, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd inflicted. But Malik didn't move. He couldn't. He'd seen this play out before, watched boys like him, boys with fire in their veins, let their anger take the wheel only to crash headlong into a system that chewed them up and spat them out. He'd learned to swallow it, to bury it deep, to let the world think it didn't matter. But today, it did. Today, the weight of that loss pressed down on him like a lead blanket, suffocating and relentless. Then, something shifted. The air in the room grew heavier, the silence thickening until it felt like a physical force pressing against the walls. A hush rippled through the scattered onlookers, court clerks, bailiffs, a handful of weary spectators, each one sensing the change before they could name it. Even Langley paused, his smirk faltering for a heartbeat as his eyes darted to the side. Standing there, just a few feet away, was Judge Camille Carter. She hadn't been part of the scene moments ago, just another figure blending into the background of the bustling courthouse. But now, she was a presence, an unyielding force that seemed to shrink the room around her. Her dark robe flowed like a shadow as she stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, each footfall a quiet promise of reckoning. She didn't speak, not yet, but she didn't need to. Her eyes steady, piercing, and brimming with a quiet fury said everything. Malik felt the shift in his bones, a flicker of hope sparking amid the ashes of his anger. He stood still, his breath shallow, his fists trembling at his sides as the sting of humiliation lingered like a bruise. The room watched, some with pity etched into their faces, others with blank indifference, and a few who couldn't even meet his gaze. It was always like this: people saw, but they didn't act. They witnessed, but they didn't care. Justice, Malik had learned, was a fickle thing, loud only when it served someone else's convenience. Langley, oblivious or defiant, spun the chain absently between his fingers, treating it like a discarded bauble he'd found on the floor. His smirk held, but there was a flicker in his eyes, now something unreadable. A shadow of doubt creeping in as he met Judge Carter's unflinching stare. She stood like a statue carved from granite, her posture radiating an authority that made the air feel thin. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating, until Langley broke it with a forced chuckle, a weak attempt to claw back control. "What's the problem here, Your Honor?" he drawled, his voice dripping with a lazy confidence that belonged to a man who'd never tasted real consequences. He held up the chain, letting the gold catch the light. "Just doing my job. This looks a little suspicious, don't you think? A kid like this walking around with something this pricey, pretty bold move." Malik's pulse thundered in his ears, a drumbeat of rage and shame that made his jaw ache from clenching it so hard. The urge to acto-fight surged again, a wildfire licking at his restraint. He could feel every eye in the room on him, could sense the weight of their judgments, their assumptions, but he held himself together. His father's voice echoing in his mind, "Stay sharp, Malik. Don't let them break you." Judge Carter's voice sliced through the tension like a blade, smooth and unwavering, yet carrying a quiet danger that made the hairs on Malik's neck stand up. "Officer Langley," she said, just his name, but the way it rolled off her tongue made the clerk at the desk flinch, and the bailiff shift uncomfortably in his boots. Langley hesitated, a crack appearing in his bravado, but he plastered on another smile, adjusting his stance as if settling into familiar territory. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his tone light but edged with defiance. Camille took another step forward, not rushed, not aggressive, but with a weight that made the room hold its breath. "Return the chain," she said, her voice flat, unyielding, leaving no room for debate. Langley blinked, just once, then let out another laugh, shaking his head as if she'd told a bad joke. "Now, hold on, Judge Carter. I don't think you understand. This could be evidence." "Evidence of what?" Her words snapped out, precise and cutting, the air itself seeming to tighten around them. Langley's smirk wavered, a small fracture in his mask, but he pressed on. "Look, all I'm saying is you're making an accusation against my son," Camille interrupted, her voice still even but now laced with something colder, sharper, a promise of ruin that made Langley's eyes flicker with unease. "So I'll ask again, evidence of what?" "Officer Langley." For the first time, something shifted in Langley's demeanor, annoyance, maybe frustration, a hint of the control he'd wielded so effortlessly slipping through his fingers. He'd built his career on bending the world to his will, twisting stories until they fit his narrative, wielding power like a blunt instrument. But now, standing before Judge Carter, that power felt flimsy, fragile. His grip on the chain tightened, his knuckles whitening. "Judge Carter, with all due respect, this is standard procedure. If he can prove ownership, Camille's voice cut through his excuse like a guillotine, the edge in her tone now razor sharp. "You tore that chain from my son's neck in a courtroom full of witnesses, and now you expect him to prove it's his. You profiled him. You saw a black boy with something valuable and assumed it was stolen. You humiliated him in a place meant to uphold justice, and you violated his rights in the process." The silence that followed was deafening, a suffocating void that swallowed every whisper, every shuffle of feet. Malik's chest ached, not just from the loss of the chain, but from the truth in her words. The weight of a lifetime of moments like this crashing down on him. Langley's jaw tightened, his defiance crumbling under the scrutiny of her gaze. But he couldn't back down, not yet, not with the room watching. Judge Carter stepped closer, her presence a storm-gathering strength, and in that moment, Malik knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice serial, unyielding justicing to the consequences of a man who'd abused his power one too many times. Langley had sealed his fate, and what came next would echo far beyond these walls. A lesson carved in the wreckage of his arrogance. The air in the courtroom thickened, heavy with the kind of tension that clings to the skin and burrows into the bones. It was the moment when every pair of eye spectators, court officials, even the dust motes suspended in the slanting light seemed to collectively hold their breath. aware that something monumental had just unfolded, something they couldn't turn away from, no matter how hard they tried. Langley stood at the center of it all, his broad shoulders squared, his uniform crisp and authoritative, but beneath that polished exterior, a tremor rippled through him. His lips parted as if a defense, a justification. Some sliver of his usual bravado might spill out and reclaim the situation. Nothing came. His tongue felt heavy, useless, pinned down by the weight of what he could no longer deny. Camille Carter took a single, deliberate step forward, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor like the ticking of a clock, counting down to an inevitable reckoning. Her voice, steady and low, sliced through the silence. Return the chain. It wasn't a request, it was a command, laced with a quiet fury that made the room feel smaller, the walls tighter. Langley's fingers twitched at his sides, restless, as if they were itching to cling to the control he'd wielded so effortlessly for years. He could feel it slipping now, unraveling like a thread pulled too hard, too fast. His pride, that towering fortress he'd built brick by brick through decades of unchecked power, refused to let him bend. Not here. Not like this. He'd spent his career lurking in the shadows of authority, bending rules, breaking spirits, all because he knew the system would shield him. It always had. But now, standing in the unyielding gaze of Camille Carter, something inside him tilted off its axis, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a rookie, unsure and untested. His eyes darted to Malik, the young man standing just a few feet away, his silence louder than any shout could have been. Malik's hands were still, his posture rigid, but his eyes burned with a fury so raw it seemed to hum in the air around him. He wasn't just waiting, he was enduring, holding himself together with a restraint that Langley couldn't fathom. In that fleeting glance, Langley understood something visceral, something that sank into his gut like a stone. This wasn't going to end with him walking away unscathed, smirking as he always did. His lips twitched upward, forcing a smirk, but it was a frail, hollow thing now, a ghost of the confidence he'd once worn like armor. He exhaled, the sound ragged and slow, and with a slight shake of his head, he extended the chain toward Malik. "Fine," he muttered, the word dripping with venom, a bitter concession he spat out like poison. Malik didn't move. His distrust hung between them, palpable, a wall Langley couldn't breach. Camille, however, stepped forward again, her movements fluid and certain. She reached out, her fingers steady as they closed around the chain, pulling it from Langley's grasp. Her face was a mask unreadable, yet brimming with an intensity that made Langley's smirk falter further. She turned to her son, her eyes softening for a fraction of a second as she pressed the chain into Malik's hands. "Hold on to it," she murmured, her voice a quiet anchor in the storm swirling around them. Those 3 words carried a weight that dwarfed every law Langley had ever twisted, every loophole he'd exploited. They were a promise, a vow, a lifeline Malik clutched as his fingers tightened around the cold metal. But Camille wasn't finished. She pivoted back to Langley, and now her expression shifted, still quiet, but edged with something lethal, a blade hidden beneath silk. "Officer Langley," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that filled the room like a thunderclap. "This conversation is far from over." The smirk was gone now, wiped clean from Langley's face. He knew it, and so did everyone else watching. Storm was brewing, dark and unstoppable. The next time he stepped into this courtroom, it wouldn't be as the untouchable figure he'd always been. It would be as a man forced to answer for every choice, every abuse, every moment he'd thought himself above consequence. The stillness that followed was suffocating, the kind that presses down until you can feel it in your chest. Langley stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might crack under the pressure. He tried to hold onto the illusion of control, rolling his shoulders back as if he could shrug off the weight of what was happening. "Are we really doing this?" he muttered, his voice thick with a forced nonchalance that didn't reach his eyes. Unease flickered there, a shadow he couldn't banish. Camille didn't flinch. "No," she replied, her tone sharp and unyielding, cutting through his bravado like a knife. "All this over you." The room seemed to shift then, the air growing heavier as a silent understanding rippled through it. This wasn't just about the chain anymore, or even what had happened between Langley and Malik in that fleeting, explosive moment. This was about every time Langley had flexed his power like a weapon. Every time he'd walked away with a grin while others nursed the wounds he'd left behind. His fingers twitched again, restless at his sides, his mouth opening as if he could summon some excuse, some way to twist this back in his favor. But Camille didn't give him the chance. "You've operated for years under the belief that your badge is a shield," she said, her voice deliberate, each word landing like a hammer on glass. "That it protects you from consequences, that it gives you the right to humiliate, to violate, to take from those you see as beneath you." She took a slow step closer, her presence towering despite her calm demeanor, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But you made a mistake today, Officer Langley. A mistake that can't be ignored." Langley's breath grew heavier, his skin tightening across his face as something akin to fear crept into his expression. He tried to scoff, to brush it off with the casual arrogance he'd perfected over the years. But it came out weak, brittle. "And what exactly is my mistake, Judge Carter?" he asked, his tone daring her to say it. Camille's eyes locked onto his, unflinching, unwavering. "You did it in my courtroom." The words hung there, sharp and final, carving into him like a blade. Langley swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as the reality of her statement settled in. "You humiliated my son," Camille continued, her voice steady, each syllable a dagger aimed at his core. "You profiled him, you assaulted him, you committed theft in front of witnesses, in front of court officials, on federal property." The silence that followed was a living thing, wrapping around Langley, squeezing until he shifted uncomfortably on his feet. His eyes flicked to Malik again, to the young man who stood like a statue, the chain clutched in his hands, his face an unreadable mask of fury and restraint. Langley tried to laugh it off, a hollow sound that died in his throat. "This is ridiculous." It was a crime," Camille cut in, her words steel, absolute, leaving no room for debate. "And for the first time, Officer Langley, you won't be walking away from it." His breath hitched, his body screaming frustration as he shifted his weight, searching for an escape that wasn't there. "Judge Carter, with all due respect," he began, but she interrupted, her voice ice cold. "There's no respect, not from me, not from anyone in this room." The doors swung open then, a sharp creak echoing through the stillness as two uniformed officers stepped inside. Their faces were neutral, professional, but their purpose was unmistakable. Langley's shoulders stiffened, his breath catching as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Camille's gaze didn't waver. "Officer Gerald Langley," she said, her voice ringing with finality, "you are being placed under arrest for misconduct, unlawful seizure of personal property, and abuse of power." Malik watched, his chest tight, as the color drained from Langley's face, just a faint shift, but enough to betray the cracks in his armor. Langley's hands tensed at his sides, his jaw locking as if he could bite back the tide crashing over him. The room felt smaller now, the air pressing down as the officers moved forward. Langley took a step back, instinctive, desperate. "This is absurd," he hissed, his voice low, his mind racing for a way out, some loophole, some trick that had always worked before. But this time, there was no escape. Camille tilted her head slightly, her eyes piercing through him. "No, Officer Langley. What's absurd is that it took this long." One of the officers stepped beside him, his voice firm, procedural. "Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back." Langley's breath was ragged now, his jaw tightening as the walls closed in. He turned to Camille one last time, his voice cracking with something raw, something Malik couldn't quite namonger, fear, disbelief. "This isn't over." She held his gaze, her expression unreadable yet haunting in its certainty. "Yes, Officer Langley," she said, her voice softer now, almost a whisper, "it is." And then, in front of the same people who had watched him wield his power with reckless abandon, Langley's wrists were pulled behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs cut through the silence like a gunshot. Malik stood there, breathless, weightless, hardly believing what he was seeing. For the first time in his life, he was witnessing a man like Langley, a man who had thrived on bending justice to his will, faced the consequences he'd denied so many others. Langley's shoulders were rigid, his head held high, but the illusion of invincibility was gone. Shattered in the quiet storm of Camille Carter's courtroom, the lesson was clear, etched into the air like a warning. Power, when abused, carries a price. And justice, when it finally arrives, spares no one. The courtroom was a cavern of silence, broken only by the sharp, metallic clatter of handcuffs snapping shoot a sound. So piercing it seemed to etch itself into the stillness, reverberating off the high ceilings and polished wooden benches. Langley stood at the center of it all, his body a taut coil of defiance, every muscle rigid as though he could will this moment out of existence. His wrists, bound tightly behind him, ached under the cold bite of steel, the cuffs digging into his flesh with an unyielding grip. His breaths came in jagged bursts, shallow and uneven, as a wildfire of rage smoldered beneath his skin. Shoulders squared, chest heaving with each deliberate inhale, he stood like a man refusing to bow, even as the reality of his defeat loomed larger with every passing second. In his mind, a storm-raged pride clashing against the bitter truth he couldn't escape. This time, there was no way out, no clever words, no strings to pull. He told himself it couldn't be real, that this was just a fleeting stumble, a minor setback he'd soon twist to his advantage. But deep down, beneath the bluster, a quiet dread was taking root. A few feet away, Malik gripped the chain in his hands, his knuckles whitening as his fingers curled tighter around the links. The metal felt cold and heavy, almost as if it might leave permanent marks in his palms, a tangible reminder of this moment he'd never let slip away. His heart thundered in his chest, a chaotic rhythm he couldn't quite decipher. Was it fury, disbelief, or something richer, something that teetered on the edge of triumph? For years, he'd watched men like Langley stride through the world unscathed, their sins glossed over with hollow excuses and bureaucratic sleight of hand. Every dodged consequence, every smirk of impunity, had carved a wound in Malik's soul, a quiet ache that had grown heavier with time. But now, standing in this courtroom, the air felt different, charged with a shift he could taste. Today, the scales had tipped, and the weight of that change pulsed through him like a living thing. Langley's exhale cut through the tension, sharp and bitter, as he shook his head in a futile attempt to reclaim his crumbling composure. His voice, when it came, was low and strained, dripping with venom he could barely contain. "This is absurd," he hissed, his jaw clenching so tightly it seemed his teeth might shatter. "Judge Carter, you know what this is: a circus, a cheap performance." His dark eyes darted between Camille and Malik, glinting with a mix of defiance and disdain. "All this because I spoke the truth about what I saw." The words hung in the air, heavy with arrogance, as if he could still bend the narrative to his will. Camille stood motionless at first, her hands clasped calmly in front of her, her face a mask of serene resolve edged with an icy sharpness. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, but when she spoke, her voice was a slow, deliberate blade, slicing through his bravado with precision. "What you saw," she repeated, each syllable weighted with intent. "You saw a young black man wearing something you decided didn't belong on him, something you deemed too good for his skin." Her tone remained steady, unshaken, a quiet force that carried the weight of years of suppressed outrage. "What you did wasn't just judgment, Langley. You stripped him of his humanity in a place built to defend it, a courtroom. A sanctuary of justice you turned into a stage for your prejudice." Langley scoffed, rolling his shoulders as far as the cuffs would allow, a bitter smirk twisting his lips. The gesture was hollow, a shadow of the confidence he once wielded like a weapon. "Humanity," he spat, the word foreign and mocking on his tongue. "That's what this is about. A wounded pride dressed up as a cause. You're blowing this out of proportion, Carter. You think you've scored some grand victory here." His voice dropped lower, his eyes narrowing into slits as he leaned forward slightly, testing the limits of his restraints. "The system doesn't bend for a single day's drama. It's bigger than this room, and you're fools if you think otherwise." Malik felt a surge of heat flare in his chest, a molten anger that clawed at his restraint. His nails bit into his palms as he took a step forward, his voice cutting through the air like a whip, sharp, controlled, but alive with raw emotion. "You talk like you're not the one standing there in chains," he said, his gaze locked on Langley's. The older man's head snapped toward him, that smirk flickering, no longer a shield but a mask slipping under the weight of desperation. Cuffs don't mean a damn thing, Langley shot back, his voice rising with a frantic edge. You think this changes anything? You think they'll let this hold? You're a kid, you don't get how the world spins. People like me don't crash, and people like you don't climb. The words were meant to wound, to slice deep and leave scars, but they fell flat, powerless against the truth unfolding before them. Malik's lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes burning with a certainty Langley couldn't touch. Because this time, Malik held something the other man didn't. Proof. Proof that the untouchable could bleed, that the towering walls of power could crack. For once, Langley wasn't the one writing the ending. Camille stepped closer, her presence a quiet storm-gathering strength. Her eyes pinned Langley in place, steady and unrelenting, as her voice cut through the room with a clarity that silenced even the echoes. You're right about one thing, she said, her tone soft but piercing, a blade wrapped in velvet. The system hasn't changed. It's still a warped, broken machine shielding men like you, failing the ones who need it most. But today, in this room, that machine didn't catch you when you fell. Langley's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring as he wrestled with the dawning weight of her words. His breaths grew heavier, his bound hands flexing into fists as the realization burrowed deeper, clawing at the foundations of his certainty. You think this matters? He snapped, his voice cracking just enough to reveal the fracture beneath his defiance. You think I'll rot in a cell for this? I've seen worse officers who've done darker things and walked free the next day. Cases vanish before they even hit the books. I've got people, connection show, think they'll let me sink. His words were a desperate flurry, a man swinging at shadows as the ground slipped away beneath him. Camille didn't waver. She let him rant, let him hurl his last gasps of bravado into the void. And then she responded, her voice a calm, unyielding tide. You think that because you've never been the one in the crosshairs, she said, tilting her head slightly, studying him as if he were a relic fading into obscurity. You've always believed your power was a shield unbreakable, eternal, that someone would always swoop in to sweep your messes under the rug. But you miscalculated, Officer Langley. Her gaze hardened, her words gaining a quiet ferocity. You didn't just get caught. You got caught in the wrong place, at the wrong time, against the wrong peoply family that wouldn't bend. Malik watched as a flicker of something new crossed Langley's face, not just anger, not just frustration, but a raw, visceral fear that hadn't been there before. Camille took another step, her voice dropping to a near whisper, intimate and lethal. You thought you were untouchable, she said, her eyes boring into his. But the only thing more dangerous than a corrupt system holding you up is when that same system decides you're a liability it can't afford. Langley's breath caught, a sharp hitch that betrayed the cracks in his armor. Before he could respond, the heavy courtroom doors swung open with a groan, ushering in a gust of cold air and a new presence. Two officers flanked a man in a crisp gray suit, a federal agent, whose very demeanor radiated authority. He carried a folder in one hand, its edges worn, but its contents clearly heavy with implication. His gaze locked onto Langley with a precision that turned the room's atmosphere electric. The agent's arrival wasn't just a formality, it was a harbinger, a signal that this moment stretched far beyond the wooden walls around them. Langley's head jerked toward the newcomers, his eyes darting wildly first to the agent, then to the officers, then back to Camille and Malik. The odds were stacking against him, a tightening noose he couldn't slip. The agent stepped forward, his voice crisp and commanding, slicing through the tension like a guillotine. Officer Gerald Langley, he announced, each word ringing with official weight. You are under investigation for multiple violations, excessive use of force, falsification of reports, coercion, and abuse of power, effective immediately. Your badge and firearm are revoked. You are now in federal custody. The silence that followed was suffocating, a void that swallowed every sound but the faint rasp of Langley's breath. His body stiffened, his mind racing through a labyrinth of escapes names to call, favors to cash in, but every path led to a dead end. This wasn't a local reprimand he could shrug off. This was a reckoning, vast and unyielding. Malik stood rooted in place, watching as the man who'd once loomed like a titan shrank before his eyes, his power dissolving into dust. For the first time, Malik tasted justice and not the abstract promise of it, but the real, living thing. unfolding in the space between them. Langley's voice, when it emerged, was a ghost of itself, barely audible. "You don't get it," he murmured, his bravado unraveling thread by thread. Camille exhaled softly, a sound almost tender in its finality. "No, Officer Langley," she said, her tone calm, almost mournful. "It's you who doesn't get it." With that, the officers seized him by the arms, their grips firm and unyielding. His footsteps dragged against the polished floor, each one a reluctant surrender as they led him away. The courtroom seemed to exhale as he vanished through the doors, the air lighter, the walls bearing witness to a shift that felt seismic. Langley was gone, his reign of arrogance toppled not just by cuffs or charges, but by the quiet, unrelenting force of those he'd underestimated. Malik lingered, his chest swelling with something new, not just relief, but a hard-earned clarity. Justice wasn't a gift handed down, it was a fire fought for, a lesson carved from the ashes of power abused. And in that moment, as the echoes of Langley's downfall faded, Malik understood its price and its promise. In the suffocating embrace of justice, the air still crackled with the remnants of a storm that had just broken. Langley's footsteps had long faded down the corridor, swallowed by the cold stone walls of the courthouse. Yet the room buzzed with an unspoken energy, a lingering hum that refused to dissipate into the silence. Malik stood rooted in the center, his chest rising and falling unevenly, his breath a jagged rhythm he couldn't quite steady. His fingers, calloused and trembling, clutched the chain that had once been torn from him, its pendant swaying slightly as though it carried the weight of everything he'd endured. It was back in his hands now, returned after a fight he hadn't been sure he could win. But the victory felt hollow, incomplete. His pulse thudded slower now, a steady drumbeat against the chaos in his mind, where thoughts spun wildly, reeling from the scene that had just unfolded, struggling to convince himself it wasn't some cruel mirage. For once, justice hadn't averted its gaze, hadn't slipped through his fingers like sand. And yet, the relief he'd expected remained just out of reach, elusive as a shadow in the dim light. Across the room, Camille Carter stood like a statue carved from resolve, her posture unwavering where she'd delivered the final, decisive strike. Her face was a mask, unreadable, betraying nothing of the storm that churned beneath. She'd spent years in courtrooms like this one, her gavel a quiet thunder that had sealed countless fates. She'd watched men like Langley arrogant, untouchable slump in that same worn chair, their empires crumbling under the weight of her words. But this wasn't just another case ticked off a docket, another routine triumph of the law grinding its slow, imperfect gears. This was personal, a reckoning that had simmered in her bones for years, a fire stoked by every injustice she'd witnessed, every wound she'd carried. She dreamed of this day, imagined the satisfaction of seeing a man like Langley dragged away, his power stripped bare. Yet now, as the dust settled, a quiet unease gnawed at her. The thrill of his fall was real, sharp-edged and electric, but it couldn't erase the wreckage left behind. The scars of his actions, and those of men like him, stretched far beyond this room, etched into lives and years that no verdict could mend. Justice had spoken, but its voice felt too small against the echoes of all that had been lost. Malik's fingers traced the chain's worn edges, the pendant cool against his skin, its grooves familiar yet somehow foreign now. It wasn't just a trinket anymore, it was heavier, laden with meaning he could feel in his marrow. This wasn't about possession, it was a symbol of what he'd nearly surrendered, what he'd clawed back through sheer will, what had been restored not by chance, but by blood and defiance. He turned it over in his palm, the faint warmth of the gold seeping into him, and yet a restless ache bloomed in his chest. He'd thought this moment would flood him with triumph, that watching Langley shuffle out in handcuffs would patch the gaping hole that had haunted him for years, but it didn't. The void remained, stubborn and unyielding. He exhaled, a slow, shuddering breath that carried more weight than he intended, and when he spoke, his voice was a low murmur, distant and raw. "Is that it?" The words slipped out, quiet but piercing, slicing through the fading tension like a blade. They hung there, suspended in the stillness, a question too big for the room to hold. Camille turned to him, her dark eyes catching the dim light, flickering with something she couldn't quite name, concern, perhaps, or the shadow of her own doubts. "What do you mean?" she asked, though the tightness in her throat told her she already knew. She'd seen that look on his face before, the way his brow furrowed, the way his jaw set with a frustration he couldn't shake. Malik lifted his gaze to hers, and in his eyes she saw a storm brewing, something unresolved, something that refused to settle. "He gets arrested," he said, his voice steady but laced with a bitterness that cut deep. "He faces charges. Maybe he goes to prison for a few years. Maybe he doesn't. But then what?" The question wasn't just about Langley, it was about everything. People like him don't vanish. They don't stop existing just because they get caught. How many more Langleys are out there? How many more walk into places like this every day, thinking they can do whatever they want because they know they'll walk away? His words grew heavier, each one a stone dropped into the silence, rippling with a fury he'd kept buried too long. Camille's lips pressed into a thin line, her composure holding firm, but her eyes softened with a quiet ache. She'd spent her life in these halls, wrestling with a system that had never been built for people like them, people who fought for scraps of fairness while men like Langley gorged on power. She'd seen the cycle too many times. One falls, another rises, an endless parade of arrogance and impunity. She'd learned to cling to the small wins, to find solace in the rare moments when the scales tipped, even slightly, toward right. But she felt her son's exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of knowing this victory was just a flicker in a darkness that stretched on and on. "You're right," she said at last, her voice softer now, as if she were speaking not just to him, but to the ghosts that haunted these walls. "One arrest doesn't fix it. One conviction doesn't heal the wounds they've left behind. There'll always be another Langley, another fight waiting." She paused, letting out a slow breath, her head tilting as she searched his face. "But today, we didn't let him win. Today, he had to answer for it, and that matters, Malik." He looked down at the chain again, its weight grounding him as her words sank in. He wanted to believe her, wanted to feel that this moment carried some lasting power, that it could shift the world even a fraction. But deep down, he knew Langley wasn't the root. He was a branch, a symptom of something festering far beyond these walls. Around them, the room stirred faintly, murmurs rising like a tide, people shifting in their seats, grappling with what they'd just seen. Some eyes lingered on Malik, on the empty space where Langley had stood moments before, his presence still a ghost in the air. Others turned away, their discomfort palpable, their silence a refusal to reckon with the truth. A clerk shuffled papers with hurried hands, an officer stared straight ahead, his face a blank slate, as if by ignoring it he could erase what had happened. The quiet from those corners roared louder than the whispers, a reminder that even now, some saw Langley as untouchable, his crimes as mere missteps. Malik's jaw tightened, a bitter edge creeping into his voice. "They still don't get it," he muttered, his gaze sweeping the room. Camille followed his eyes, her own narrowing as she took in the zenith averted glances. "The forced busyness. Some of them never will," she said, turning to face him fully, her tone steady but threaded with something fierce. "But they're not the ones who matter. You are. The people who stand up, who refuse to let it slide again, are the ones who count. We don't fight for the ones who won't see. We fight for the ones who might." Her words landed like a spark, igniting something in him, though the unease still coiled tight in his chest. He rolled her words over in his mind, testing their weight. She was right, change wasn't a single, blazing triumph. It was a slow burn, a relentless push against a tide that never stopped pulling. But knowing that didn't make it easier. His fingers closed around the chain, his grip firm, resolute. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but carried a new depth, a resolve forged in the fire of this moment. "I just don't want to wait for the next one." Camille nodded, a flicker of pride lighting her eyes, mingled with the quiet sorrow of a mother who'd always known her son would inherit this war. "Neither do I," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the only way to stop it is to keep going, to keep fighting." Malik let out a slow breath, and for the first time since Langley's cuffs had clicked shut, a faint lightness stirred within him, not because the battle was won, but because he knew he wouldn't face it alone. The courtroom buzzed on around them, its rhythm shifting, settling into a new normal. The air still thrummed with the weight of what had passed, thick and unshaken, like the aftermath of a tempest that had torn through and left chaos in its wake. People moved against him, hurrying out, others lingering, their faces a gallery of shock, doubt, and reluctant awe. Malik stood there, the chain pressed into his palm, its edges biting faintly into his skin. He'd walked in expecting another day of disillusionment, another brush with a system that chewed up hope and spat it out. But now, he stood in the ruins of something unexpected, a crack in the armor of power, a glimpse of what could be. Camille watched him, her gaze steady, tracing the lines of tension in his young face. At 16, he already carried the weight of battles she'd hoped he'd never have to fight, his eyes reflecting a history she couldn't shield him from. She stepped closer, her voice cutting through the noise with a calm that demanded attention. "Malik, what happened today?" He cut her off, his words sharp but soft, a quiet fire burning beneath them. "It's not enough." And in that moment, the lesson crystallized just of justice's fleeting grasp, but of the cost of power unchecked. Langley's fall was a warning, a mirror held up to those who wielded their might without care, a testament to the ruin that follows when arrogance oversteps. For Malik and Camille, it was a call to endure, to press on, knowing that every step forward carved a deeper wound into the beast they fought. The room might settle, the world might turn, but they would be ready for whatever came next. Together, unbowed, unbroken, Malik stood there, his breath escaping in a slow, unsteady stream through his nose, the kind of exhale that carried more than just air. It carried the weight of everything he couldn't quite put into words. He shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible movement, his eyes dropping to the chain dangling from his fingers. The metal links glinted faintly under the dim courtroom lights, cold and unyielding, as if they might hold some secret, some answer to the storm churning inside him. Did it even matter? He wasn't sure. His mind spun with questions that gnawed at him, relentless and sharp. They'd taken Langley a wager, that was something, but how long would it last? How long before the man slipped back into the world, free again, wearing a different badge, a different title, wreaking the same havoc on someone else's life? Malik's grip tightened around the chain, his knuckles whitening as the frustration surged, hot and thick, threatening to swallow him whole. And what about the next Langley? How long before another one stepped into the void, eager to wield the same corrupt power? Across from him, Camille stood steady, her gaze locked on his. Her face was a fortress, resolute, unshaken, but there was a flicker of something softer in her eyes now, a quiet tenderness that pierced through the armor she wore so well. "It mattered," she said, her voice firm at first, cutting through the haze of his doubt like a blade. Then, softer, almost a whisper, she added, "But I know why you don't feel like it does." Her words hung there, heavy with understanding, and Malik couldn't hold back the dry, bitter laugh that escaped him. He shook his head again, harder this time, as if he could shake off the tangle of emotions clawing at his chest. "It's just," he stopped, exhaling sharply, the sound jagged and raw. The frustration swelled again, a tidal wave crashing against the walls he'd built to keep himself steady. "They still looked at me the same," he said, his voice low, tight with something that wasn't quite anger but wasn't far from it. "The people in that room, the ones who saw what he did, who knew he was wrong, they still looked at me like I was the problem, like I was just some kid with a grudge, kicking up dust over something they didn't even think was worth the fuss." His jaw clenched, the muscles twitching as he fought to keep his voice steady. They weren't shocked by what he did. They were just shocked he got caught. Camille's lips pressed together, not in judgment, but in a quiet, knowing empathy. She'd walked this earth long enough, seen enough of its ugliness, to understand the truth in her son's words. Justice wasn't just about hauling someone off in cuffs, it was about how people saw it, how they weighed it in their minds. And for too many in that courtroom, Langley's actions weren't the aberration, his punishment was. She took a step closer, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos swirling around him. Her fingers brushed his wrist, light but deliberate, grounding him in a way that only she could. The touch was warm, familiar, a lifeline pulling him back from the edge. "That's why we keep fighting," she said, her voice low but unshakable. "Because if we don't, nothing changes, because they expect us to give up, to shrug and say the system's too broken to fix. But we don't, we fight anyway." Malik swallowed hard, his throat constricting as a flood of emotions rose and crashed against him, anger, grief, hope, all tangled together in a relentless tide. And what if it's never enough? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, raw with the weight of his doubt. Camille sighed, tilting her head slightly as she studied him, her eyes searching his face. Then we fight anyway, she repeated, her tone steady, a rock against the storm. Because if we stop, they win. And that's not an option. Her words settled between them, dense and real, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the silence. Malik wanted to believe her. Deep down, he could feel the ember of fire still flickering inside him, begging to be stoked into something more than just aimless rage. But it was so damn hard to stand in the wreckage of a moment like this, and not feel trapped in an endless cycle, a play with no final act. A voice broke through the stillness, hesitant but clear, slicing into their shared reverie. Judge Carter, Malik, and Camille turned in unison. Near the back of the courtroom, a young woman stood, clutching a notepad so tightly her fingers seemed to tremble against the edges. She couldn't have been much older than her late 20s, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her posture stiff with the kind of nervous energy that comes from stepping out of a role you've been trained to stay in. She'd been there all along, a silent witness among the rows of benches, her pen scratching across paper as she recorded the day's events. She was a court reporter serene, meant to stay invisible, to capture the words and actions without ever letting her own spill out. But now she was moving forward, her steps tentative but deliberate, her eyes darting between Camille and Malik as if she wasn't sure who to address first. Her throat bobbed, her voice faltering as she started. She paused, shaking her head as if wrestling with herself, then pushed on, stronger this time. I just wanted to say that I saw it would happen, and I know it's not my place. But she let out a shaky breath, her shoulders squaring as she found her footing. It's the first time I've seen someone like him actually held accountable. I've watched things happen in this building, things that never make it into a report, never get a second glance, never lead to anything. But today, it did. Her gaze shifted to Malik, locking onto him with an intensity that caught him off guard. You made that happen, she said, her voice steady now, carrying a sincerity that hit him like a punch to the chest. Malik blinked, thrown by the weight of her words, by the fact that she'd even said them. He wasn't used to Thisamione stepping out of the shadows to speak, someone who didn't owe him a damn thing choosing to say something real. He didn't know what to do with it, how to respond. The woman offered a small, almost sheepish smile, her eyes flickering back to Camille for a moment. I just thought you should know that some of us saw it, she added softly, and that it mattered. With that, she turned, her heels tapping faintly against the worn courtroom floor as she walked away, leaving behind a silence that felt different now, less oppressive, tinged with something new. Malik exhaled slowly, his fingers loosening around the chain, the tension in his body easing just a fraction. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe it wasn't the triumph he'd imagined. But maybe, just maybe, it was a beginning. Camille watched him, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile, a glimmer of pride breaking through her steady demeanor. She rested a hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently, her touch warm and grounding. Come on, she said, her voice softer now, laced with that motherly tone that always seemed to pull him back to earth. Let's go home. Malik nodded, slipping the chain back around his neck, feeling its familiar weight settle against his chest once more. But this time, it didn't drag him down like a stone. This time, it felt like a marker, a quiet testament to what had happened, to what he'd fought for. The courthouse doors loomed ahead as they stepped outside, heavier than they should have been, as if they were pushing against more than just wood and hinges. It was like shoving against the entire weight of the day, the accusations, the stares, the fleeting victory that still didn't feel quite real. The Atlanta heat hit them hard, thick and suffocating, clinging to their skin like a damp shroud. Around them, the city buzzed on, indifferent cars honking, tires screeching against asphalt, people weaving through the streets with their heads down, chasing their own lives. To them, nothing had changed. The world spun forward as if a man's fate hadn't just shifted inside those walls. But Malik knew better. Something had cracked open in there, a fissure in the unyielding stone of a system that had stood too long unchallenged. His fingers brushed the chain again, tracing the pendant's edges where it pressed into his skin. It felt different now, not heavier with despair, but with something else, something alive. This wasn't the weight of defeat anymore. It was the weight of realization, of knowing that real power didn't lie in the hands of men like Langley, or the machinery of a broken system. It lived here, in moments like this, in the refusal to let injustice stand unanswered. Camille walked beside him, her heels clicking softly against the cracked pavement, a steady rhythm in the chaos of the city. She didn't speak at first, didn't rush to fill the silence with platitudes. She knew him too well for that, knew when he needed room to breathe, to let the pieces settle in his mind. But after a few steps, she broke the quiet, her voice warm but firm. "You did good today." Malik exhaled, staring straight ahead as they moved through the humid air, the words sinking and slow. "Did I?" he replied, not bitter but not convinced either, his tone hovering somewhere between doubt and exhaustion. "Because I don't know if it feels that way." Camille glanced at him, her eyes sharp with understanding. "You think justice is supposed to feel like relief," she said, her words more a reflection than a question. Like something neat and final, she shook her head, a faint, rueful smile tugging at her lips. "It's never like that. It's messy, tangled up in 1,000 loose ends. It never feels like enough because it isn't. One man facing consequences doesn't undo what he's done. It doesn't mend the cracks in the system that let him thrive." Malik let out a small, hollow laugh, nodding as her words mirrored the churn in his gut. "Exactly," he said, his voice rough. "So how do you keep going? How do you sit in that courtroom, day after day, knowing it's just one battle in a war that never ends?" Camille fell silent for a moment, her steps slowing as she weighed her response. Then she sighed, a sound heavy with years of carrying that very question. "Because sometimes," she said finally, "all it takes is one win to remind you why you fight at all." She turned to him, her gaze piercing and sure. And today was a win. Malik chewed on that, letting her words seep into the raw, aching parts of him. She was writhe, knew she wasped it didn't make the weight lighter. "It just doesn't feel real yet," he admitted, shaking his head. Langley walked around for years, doing whatever he damn well pleased, knowing no one would touch him. And now, in one day, it's over. It feels too easy. Camille let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no lightness in it, only the bitter edge of experience. "It wasn't easy," she corrected, her voice firm. "It only looks that way because you're standing at the end of it. This took years, sires of men like him skating by, years of people looking the other way, years of the right moment building up to crack it all open. It took the right eyes watching, the right voices speaking, the right push at the right time." She paused, tilting her head to meet his gaze. "And it took you, Malik. You standing there, refusing to let it slide." He scoffed lightly, brushing off the weight of her words. "All I did was." But she cut him off with a look, sharp and unwavering. "All you did was everything," she said, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "You didn't let him walk away unchallenged. You didn't let them bury it. That's not nothing." The words landed hard, stirring something deep in him, a flicker of pride he wasn't ready to fully grasp. He looked away, his fingers tightening around the chain again, feeling its edges bite into his skin. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't the clean sweep he'd wanted, but it was something to spark a shift, a reminder that justice wasn't just a gavel falling, but a fight worth waging. And as they walked on, the city humming around them, that spark burned a little brighter, a quiet promise that this wasn't the end, but a step toward something greater. "It seems like your message got cut off, but I think I understand the gist of what you're sharing, a powerful, emotional story about Malik, a young man who stood up to an abusive figure of authority. Langley, in a courtroom, with the support of his mother. Camille, who seems to be a judge or someone tied to the legal system. And the unexpected encouragement from Jared, a neighborhood acquaintance. Malik's actions sparked a ripple effect of change. Langley's arrest led to investigations, exposed corruption, and shifted the power dynamics in their community. It's a story about resilience, the weight of small victories, and the slow, surprising unfolding of justice. If you'd like me to expand on this, analyze it, or help you refine it further, just let me know. For now, I'll respond to what's here. How about I summarize Malik's journey as I see it, and you tell me if I've got it right? Malik starts off humiliated and resentful. Dragged into a courtroom, he associates with failure and injustice. But with Camille's fierce belief in him, he finds the strength to confront Langley, a corrupt officer who's terrorized their neighborhood for years. Malik doesn't see it as a choice at first, just survival, but Jared's gratitude makes him realize the impact he's had. What he thought was a personal win becomes a communal one, unraveling a web of corruption and giving voice to others who'd been silenced. Over the weeks, Malik grapples with the surreal weight of it all, not as a hero, but as someone who refused to break. Camille, ever his anchor, helps him see that change doesn't announce itself, it creeps in, moment by moment, until the impossible becomes real. Does that capture it? Or did you have a specific question or direction in mind? Malik Carter stood alone in the dim glow of his bathroom, the flickering fluorescent light casting long shadows across the tiled floor. His reflection stared back at him from the mirror, a man transformed yet still grappling with the weight of what he'd become. His fingers brushed against the chain draped around his neck, tracing the worn ridges of the pendant that hung there, its metal warm from resting against his skin all day. It was more than just jewelry, it was a tether to his father, a man who'd once borne its burden, its quiet significance. Now, that legacy rested on Malik's shoulders, and for the first time, he didn't feel like a speck dwarfed by the world's indifference. He felt a stirring deep within, a flicker of something greater, a sense that he could rise above the forces that had always pressed him down. This wasn't just a fleeting moment of clarity, it was the dawn of something vast, a story stretching far beyond the confines of that night. The world outside his small apartment buzzed with a restless energy, but inside, the silence wrapped around him like a heavy coat. He thought of the courtroom, that cold, unforgiving space where he'd once watched so many other people who shared his skin. His struggle crumpled beneath a system rigged to grind them into dust. For years, he'd seen it as a machine too massive to challenge, its gears oiled with apathy and power. Yet, on that day, he'd stepped into its jaws not as a victim, but as a man who'd had enough. The memory of it lingered in his chest, a victory that felt both monumental and fragile, like a stone poised at the edge of a cliff. It wasn't a burden he carried, it was a fire, a reminder that power didn't belong only to those who wrote the laws, but to those who refused to let those laws crush their spirit. That single act of defiance had ignited a storm Malik could never have foreseen. Langley, the officer who'd loomed over his life like a shadow, was gone, no dragged from the courthouse in handcuffs, his pale face twisted with shock and fury. Malik had stood there, watching him go, his heart steady rather than racing with triumph. Langley had built his life on the belief that he was untouchable, a predator cloaked in a badge, wielding the system like a weapon to intimidate, to silence, to destroy. For years, he'd harassed Malik and countless others, planting evidence, twisting truths, locking away the innocent with a smirk. But that day, the hunter became the hunted, his arrogance crumbling as the cuffs clicked shut. Malik didn't gloat. He simply absorbed the quiet certainty that justice, when fought for, could topple even the mightiest tyrants. The fallout rippled outward, unstoppable and fierce. Investigations that had moldered in dusty file cabinets, ignored by a department complicit in its silence, were suddenly thrust into the light. Witnesses who'd once cowered in fear, shopkeepers, mothers, teenagers who'd felt Langley's wrath, found their voices, their stories spilling forth like water through a breached dam. Each tale was a crack in the foundation of a corrupt empire, a young man framed for a crime he didn't commit, a woman threatened into silence, a father beaten in an alley for daring to question authority. Malik's name became a whisper on their lips, a symbol of the spark that had set it all ablaze. He hadn't meant to become a catalyst, only wanted to stand his ground, but now he was the ember that had lit a wildfire. Beyond Langley, the department itself trembled under the scrutiny. Officers who'd once slapped backs with him in the locker room, chuckling at his cruelty, now scrambled to save themselves. Some resigned in the dead of night, slipping away like thieves. Others clung to their badges, their excuses thin and desperate as they distanced themselves from the man they'd once shielded. The air was thick with tension, a reckoning long overdue. Malik walked home one afternoon, the autumn wind tugging at his jacket, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, squinting at the screen as a message from Jared glowed up at him. "You see the news? They fired 3 more today, man. You really did that." He stood there on the cracked sidewalk, the city humming around him, and let the words sink in. Hero, revolutionary. He didn't feel like either. He'd just been tired of bending, tired of breaking, tired of being another name scratched into the system's ledger of the defeated. That evening, the sky above the city stretched wide and bruised with twilight as Malik sat on his porch, the pendant glinting faintly against his chest. The neighborhood murmured around him, car engines rumbling, kids laughing in the distance, the faint clatter of dishes from a nearby house. Camille, his friend and a weary soldier in her own right, appeared from the dusk, her footsteps soft on the weathered steps. She didn't say anything at first, just settled beside him, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos of his thoughts. They watched the lights flicker to life across the sprawl of the city, a constellation of lives unfolding beneath the gathering dark. After a long stretch of quiet, she broke the silence, her voice low and knowing. "You're still turning it over in your head, aren't you?" It wasn't a question she saw through him like glass. Malik let out a slow breath, dragging a hand across his face as if he could wipe away the tangle of emotions knotting inside him. "It doesn't feel real," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the chain. Its weight a constant reminder of where he'd been and what he'd overcome. "None of it does." Camille shifted, resting her elbows on her knees, her dark eyes catching the faint glow of a street lamp. "That's because change never feels real while it's happening," she said, her tone carrying the weight of years spent battling from within the system she'd sworn to serve. "It feels like chasing a ghost, impossible, unreachable, until one day you blink, and it's there." He turned to her, studying the lines etched into her face, lines carved by frustration, by hope, by the endless fight to mend a world that kept breaking. "Did you ever think something like this could happen?" he asked, his voice softer now, searching. She exhaled, her breath curling into the cool air as she weighed her response. "Not like this," she confessed, her honesty raw. "I've spent my whole career clawing at the edges of this mess, knowing every win comes with 100 losses waiting in the wings. But this," she glanced at him, a rare smile tugging at her lips, small but genuine. "This blindsided me, and I'm glad it did. It means there's still room for the world to surprise us." Her words settled over him like dust after a storm, quiet but heavy with meaning. Malik had spent so long convinced that the system was an unyielding monolith, a beast designed to devour people like him, people who dared to dream beyond the bars it built around them. Yet here he was, living proof that even the most stubborn stone could crack under enough pressure. Later that night, back in the stillness of his bathroom, he faced his reflection once more. His fingers moved over the pendant again, its familiar grooves a map of resilience passed down through generations. His father had worn it through his own battles, carrying its quiet strength until the end. Now, it was Malik's to bear, and with it came a revelation. He wasn't powerless. He wasn't small. He was a force, a beginning. This wasn't just about one man's stand. It was a testament to what happens when silence shatters. When someone dares to defy the lie that change is impossible. It creeps in slowly, through fleeting moments and hard-won choices, through the stubborn souls who refuse to bow even as the world roars for them to yield. Malik hadn't strode into that courtroom aiming to topple John. She only wanted to breathe, without a boot on his neck. But that's the beauty of courage. Sometimes, a single spark of resistance can set ablaze everything meant to hold you down. So picture yourself in his shoes, the air thick with tension, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing against your back. Would you have stood tall, your voice cutting through the din? Would you have fought? Or would you have let the world whisper that it's futile? These aren't just tales spun from imagination, they're echoes of the battles unfolding every day, in courtrooms and corners, in the hearts of those who choose to rise. Justice isn't a gift handed down from on high, it's a prize seized by those bold enough to demand it. And if this story stirs something in you, if it lights a fire or cracks open a question you've buried deep, then don't let it fade. Subscribe to Tales of Twist, where stories like this live, stories that rattle your bones, challenge your certainties, and leave you wondering what twist waits just beyond the horizon. Hit that button, turn on the bell, because the next tale might be the one that changes everything.